watching NotesIn9.
Hello, and welcome to NotesIn9. I'm David Leedy. Episode 86, Sharing Managed Beans and XPages, Part 3. Beans aren't required, but you can elect to use them or not. Okay, this is Part 3 of a three-part series that Russ has come on the show to do. Before we get into it, I just wanted to throw this up here again of other resources for getting into Java. I'm a big fan of howtoprogramwithjava.com by Trevor Page. We've got a bunch of Notes9 resources out there. Google's your friend. Stack Overflow, I might not be talking about Stack Overflow enough, but that's a great resource for programming questions, development issues. There's a growing section on XPages there, and XPages questions with many answers and stuff like that. So make sure you don't miss Stack Overflow. Okay, so Russ comes back on the show, and Russ is a great guy, and he's a good friend, and he's a good speaker, and he's a member of the XPages Bootcamp team with Paul Calhoun. They just finished something up in Las Vegas, and I believe that they have Chicago in a couple weeks. If you're interested in XPages work, that's I'm sure a great event, and I'm so bummed I didn't get to be there in Las Vegas because that would be the place to be over Halloween, but maybe next time. So anyway, with all that crap being said, let's go to the demo, and Russ is going to conclude his demonstration on managed beans, on sharing the data in between them to make your XPages apps work in some ways a little better.
Hi, my name is Russell Maher. I'd like to talk to you about sharing bean data in XPages, which is essentially sharing data between your managed beans and your XPages applications. This is part 3. In part 1, we talked about the setup, how to look at the demo application, take a look at the XPages that were in use, the managed beans that were in use, the Faces-config. Talked a little bit about why you would want to use managed beans. In part 2, we discussed how to share data between those multiple managed beans using both the session scope and a variable resolver. In this part 3, we're going to talk about using managed properties to share data between managed beans. So just real quick, I'm an independent notes consultant outside of Chicago, and I've been doing this since 1993. Myself and Paul Calhoun deliver the XPages Bootcamp and the XPages Advanced Bootcamp seminars for the View magazine. My contact information is here. If you have any questions at all about the slides or anything related to XPages or Nomino or whatever, feel free to contact me. And if I don't have an answer for you, I will try to find somebody that might, or point you in the right direction. There's some other NotesIn9 resources that are available that, depending on where you're at with Java and managed beans, you might want to take a look at. Jeremy Hodge put together episodes 52, 53, and 54 as an introduction to Java for XPages developers. That would be a good intro to Java development if you're an XPager, if you don't know Java already. Even if you do know Java, there's always something good to learn from Jeremy. David Leedy has episode 76, which is another take on putting together managed beans. David and I both agree that the more different perspectives you get on the same topic, the better off you're going to be. So, if my explanations didn't really get down to the very basics of it, but David does. So between those two seminars, you should be able to do pretty well. So managed bean properties. Let's talk a little bit about managed bean properties. So the deal is, when you create a managed bean in your application, you have to configure that in the Faces-config.xml file. You declare, you say, hey, this is the name of my managed bean, and this is the class, and this is the scope for it. Well, from JSF, we have the ability to also add managed property settings in the Faces-config for a particular bean. And all a managed property does is allow you to set the default value of your managed bean in the Faces-config file. So for instance, let's say you had a loan bean and you needed to have an interest rate property, and you wanted the interest rate to default to 2% whenever the bean was initially instantiated. Well, you can go to the Faces-config.xml file, put a managed property setting in there, give the value a name and the value a value, and then when that loan bean is instantiated, automatically the loan rate will be 2%. Now, the bean can change that value live, but the default value is just configured in the managed property itself. So when we're talking about using one managed bean as a property of another managed bean, the process is the same. You configure that in your config file, and basically you've got one bean that is going to sort of contain the other bean. Now that's not really the right terminology, but essentially at runtime, when you go to access the other bean, bean number one can actually just reach inside of itself and access bean number two. So it's just a different way of sharing data between multiple managed beans. Okay, so let's see if we can't sort of get a visual on the difference between these two methodologies. In part two, we talked about using a session map and a variable resolver to reach outside of the tabs bean and go connect to the user bean. And so in that case, the user bean itself was one object and the tabs bean was a separate object. They're both configured to be in the session scope. But whenever we needed information from the user bean, we reached out either through a variable resolver or through the session map, and we grabbed a hold of that bean, and then we read, in our case, an array of information describing which tabs that user could see. So in the session map variable resolver way, the tabs object, the tabs bean, is reaching out to go get the user object. In the managed property version of that, we configure a property for the tabs object, the tabs bean, and we say, oh, by the way, you happen to have a property that's of the type user object, so mwlug user. So the difference here is the bean itself, the tabs bean, will actually contain its own reference, its own internal reference to the user bean, and then whenever the tabs bean needs to contact the user bean, it can do it just from right inside. So let's take a look at that. The steps to make that happen are pretty straightforward. In the tabs bean, you would want to declare an object or a property variable of the type of bean that is the other bean. So in our case, we've got the tabs bean and we have the user bean. In the tabs bean, we're going to say, oh, by the way, you have a variable called mwlug user, and it's going to be an mwlug user object class. In the tabs bean, you also have to have a setter method that tells it, hey, by the way, you actually have one of these things. So the reason you have to have that is because when the beans get instantiated and the expression language from the config file is all evaluated, it needs to have a setter. And so the setter is going to basically be there to say, oh, yeah, sure, there's this variable that's configured, this property is configured for a default value, but that means I have to have an associated setter. So it is required to have that number two. And that's a really easy thing to forget. I can't tell you the amount of hours I've probably spent tracking down code that wasn't working because I just forgot to put a setter method in there for that managed property. So definitely have to declare it as an object in the container bean, set up a setter method in the container bean, and then you've got to go through and configure your Faces-config.xml file. Now in our Faces-config.xml file, we already have a configuration for the user bean. We said it was this class, and we said it was a session scope variable, or bean. This time in this part, we're going to introduce a new bean. We're going to call it the log bean. It's going to be the mwlug log class. It's also going to be a session bean, but it's going to have one of these here managed properties. So again, this is all in the config file. And so what happens is we said, okay, this bean, this log bean, actually is going to have a property declared as current user, and it's going to be an mwlug user object. The value, the default value for that, we're going to provide the expression language binding to the user bean. So that's what's going on here. We named the user bean a user. In the log bean, we said you've got a managed property called current user, and by default, we're going to make the value of the current user property be the a user bean. There you go. That's all you need to do to connect or properly configure one bean to be a managed property of the other bean. Once you have that configured, then in order to use it, it's pretty straightforward. Now you've already declared it as a variable in your container bean, so in our case the log bean, anytime you want to use that, you pretty much just refer to the variable. So current user is going to be a reference or a handle or a variable representing the user bean. So anytime you want to do something with the user bean, you just say, great, give me current user, and you can run any of its methods that are in that other bean. Pretty straightforward. Let's take a look at the code. Okay, let's take a look at the record XSP. I want to show you how this works, from the client side before we talk about the code. I'm in record XSP, which we've seen before, and if you remember, we could set a current step and click the Save and Rebuild Tabs button. That's going to go through and combine the tabs that I'm allowed to see with the workflow step and display the right tabs. Nothing new there. We do have this other button though, so if I change this to say 1. So step 0, step 1, step 2, step 3 I don't see, step 4. I'm going to click the Save, Rebuild Tabs and Log button. It's going to change the tabs, which makes sense. But in addition to that, it's actually going to go over and create a log entry. So I'm looking at these log entries. This log entry, the top one, let's just get rid of these other two for kicks. This top log entry was just created, and it's not a crazy awesome log entry. It just has my name and it has some custom action in there. So the deal is, whenever you're doing logging, you typically want to know, well, who did that thing? And there's of course multiple ways to get the information about who did that thing, but we're talking about ways to share data between managed beans as managed properties. So let's go take a look at how that actually works. First thing is, I have here the mwlug log object. Now in this bean we've declared our variable as mwlug user, and we've declared it as one of these types. In other words, it's a user object. In our argumentless constructor, I just have a little debug statement, which we'll cover here at the end. So the constructor gets run the first time the log is instantiated and not after that. And then in the add log entry method, which is the only real method in here, we get the current database using our utils that we talked about last time, and we just add some values to the fields. Nothing magical there. The magical part though is, here's where we actually call our managed property. So we called it mwlug user here. Down here we're saying, great, call the get full name method of the mwlug user object. And the only other thing in here is the setter that we mentioned. So the setter is there so that when this log bean is instantiated, the expression language binding actually can figure out which property to set. Let's take a look at the Faces-config real quick. This is just like in the slides. We already have the user bean all configured here by name. In the log bean, which we've called log bean here, decided it's going to be this kind of an object. It's session scope. Here's the other connections. Here's mwlug user. That connects directly to this mwlug user. That's how they're connected. It's a property. Now it's just a managed property. The default value is going to, again, use expression language, EL, to bind to a bean called a user. And so the first time that the log bean instantiates itself, the default value for the mwlug user is going to be the user bean. And so that's pretty much it. If you look at the XPage itself and you look at the code for that bean, button, it's real straightforward. All we did was add one line of code right here to say, oh, by the way, run the add log entry method of the log bean. And of course, you could put whatever kind of text you need to in here, and there's a bazillion ways to configure messages and different ways to do that. That's not the hard part. So we still have our two beans, the tabs bean, a log bean and the user bean. We said, by the way, the log bean has a property called mwlug user. in the Faces config, we configured the default value for that property to be the user bean. When the log bean gets instantiated, and by the way, it gets instantiated right here. So the first time you call any managed bean, it's going to fully instantiate itself. So when it gets instantiated through log entry, it's going to automatically look around for that user bean, and it's going to put that in the log bean property. Before I finish up, I want to just talk about one thing that I've sort of left out. I referred to it across these three parts, but I kept deferring. As a general habit, I now put a private Boolean debug switch in my bean code. And the purpose of that is I set up a lot of if statements like this that basically say, hey, if the debug thing is true, then do a little println. Now, this is absolutely, positively, maybe the worst way to do actual debugging known to man. And if you really want to know about probably proper, fancy, great ways to do debugging, you should take a look at Julian Robichaud's Lotusphere 2012, January 2012 presentation. He does a fantastic thing on debugging, Java debugging, and XPages. Now, in my situation, I have a lot of beans, and mostly when something breaks, I need to find out where it broke quickly. So I've kind of peppered all of my beans with these debug switches, these debug lines, and I when I need to go and sort of sleuth it out to find out which of the, I don't know, 10, 15, 20,000 lines of code, I don't know what it is now, but it's a lot. I just need to know, I need to know quickly where the problem is. So in general, I actually do something like this. I'll put in here something like, mwlog log, constructor, and except I'm using the traditional spelling there of constructor. And what I'll do is, so I'll actually indicate in the println exactly where this code is, and then I will log that. Now that all gets logged to the Domino log file. It also gets logged to the server screen, and so you can pretty quickly find that out, and you can turn these things on and off. So one of the really, really nice things about using managed beans is that you don't have to restart the server to update them. So for instance, if I just turn this to true right now, and then I run this, well, I don't have to do anything with the server. It's just going to automatically happen. I don't even really have to restart the browser there. I did that because the log bean has already been instantiated once. So if we click this again, let's put in here step 2. We'll rebuild that. That should have instantiated the log file at that point. Let's take a look at our server console. Should be right here. Right there you go. mwlog constructor log just created. So if you need to change something live in a managed bean, all you have to do is go in, change the code, save it. The next time that code is run by anybody, it's going to be the new stuff. So the way I use this is I pretty much put these in. Generally, they're all turned to false. And then if I need to find out where the problem is, I'll jump into the managed bean, turn it to true, run the code, see what barks, and then I have a much quicker way to find it. And again, I'm not holding that out as best practice. I'm just saying that's a very, very convenient thing that I've done. I end up with a lot of code, I think, that has things like this, which, again, I don't know. My stuff performs pretty well, so I'm not too worried about this. But I mean, fact is, if this ran, oh gosh, it's going to take an extra 2 milliseconds to run, but it might save me 20 minutes finding some code. So that's one thing I just wanted to point out that I really haven't addressed too much. There is one other thing that I just want to mention. When you talk about using managed properties along with beans, it's important that your scopes match. So for instance, let's just say that this user bean was only configured to last as long as a single request. Well, in request scope, it gets called and then it goes away once the request is over. Well, if it's gone and you set it up as a property for another bean and this bean lasts longer, you're going to have problems. Now, if you do something like this, oh, this is a request scope, and this one's a request scope, life's going to be good. If you do something like this, that's going to be fine, because this thing here will still exist even though this bean is running as a is just in request scope. So that's just the last little piece of information about these managed properties. You definitely have to make sure that the scopes make sense. In other words, you don't want to be using one bean as a property if it's already been gone. Okay, well that's it for part 3, using managed properties. I hope these have been helpful. I want to thank David Leedy for letting me put these out there. And if you have any questions, my contact information is in each of the parts, and you can get a hold of me. Other than that, thanks very much.
And that's the demo. I thank Russ very much for this series. I do truly appreciate it. I know there's been a lot of interest in this series. And if you have any questions for me, please, here's my contact information, and I thank you for your time.